understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Time for the podcast. How you doing there? And it is going to be a good one, if not a rather terrifying podcast. I hope all is well in your life. I'm just going to start with the prospect of MAGA coming to the Oris, not necessarily to win, but to totally and utterly change the presidential election in this country, which is on the 7th of November. Conor McGregor turns up the White House, clearly intent to run for the presidency here. He will be supported by the MAGA movement. Steve Bannon will be here. Steve Bannon will do what he always does, which he says in his own words, he will flood the zone with shit, meaning they will lie, they will use all sorts of false information, fake news, that whole thing, to elevate the candidacy of Conor McGregor. It will be chaos. It will be like no presidential election we have ever seen. And
we need to be out in the streets.
Elon Musk will bankroll the whole thing. Not that McGregor needs to be bankrolled because he's a wealthy man, but I just want to prepare our Irish audience for the fact that we thought that MAGA was a foreign American concept. We thought these ideas would not necessarily lap up to our shores. And we thought these ideas, these electoral ways of doing business, were very much the American politics stroke reality TV modernity. Not anymore. Reality TV is about to come to Ireland in what usually is a rather tepid election, the presidential election, because the position, as we know, is ceremonial. It's more of a figurehead. It's got very, very little absolute or even relative power, but that doesn't matter. It is a theatre of war for the MAGA movement, and we are about to combat, John. And that is something we've got to get our heads around.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you mentioned Steve Bannon there. I mean, this was Steve Bannon's plan since the first Trump election. You know, he's been traveling around Europe, stirring up all sorts of shite in Italy, in Hungary, in Eastern Germany, the whole lot. And this is his plan kind of coming together. It's kind of horrendous.
And he is a 100% Irish American with an Irish wife. He was born in Limerick. So there you go.
His wife was born in Limerick.
His wife was born in Limerick.
Okay.
Possibly his second wife, right?
Right.
Was born in Limerick.
Third or fourth or whatever.
Anyway, the point is, MAGA is coming to the Emerald Isle, and people better get their heads around that in the guise of the presidential run of Conor McGregor, which was blessed in the White House on St. Patrick's Day. Now, John, I want to take that idea.
Yes.
Explain what is going on right now in Europe, particularly with respect to Ukraine. In a couple of minutes, we are going to talk to an amazing Ukrainian historian, Olesya Khromeychuk. And I want to talk to her about a Ukrainian history, about the culture, about the people, about what's happening in the war. But the reason I want to do this is against the background of a worldview that has shifted so dramatically that I wouldn't say small countries, because Ukraine is not small. In fact, it's the biggest country in Europe, ex-Russia, if you include Russia in Europe. Yep. It has 40 million people. It is an enormous country, but small in terms of the great powers. Small in terms of the great powers. And I want to talk to you about a possible explanation, John, for why Trump and the MAGA movement has sided overwhelmingly with the Russians and increasingly the Chinese. You might remember he was going to do the devil against the Chinese, slap on massive tariffs. Tariffs are coming on April the 2nd. As far as we know,
the
smallest tariffs will be on China. The largest tariffs will be on America's allies. So how do we explain that against the background of the phone call between Putin and Trump this week? The fact that basically America is frankly negotiating against itself. I mean, it's hilarious. Like, do you know what I mean? There's a great expression in poker, John, which is in a proper poker game, you have 5 minutes to understand or appreciate who is the gobshite. And if you haven't figured it out after 5 minutes, the gobshite is you.
Yeah.
You're playing against yourself. And that's what the Americans are doing. They're negotiating against themselves to tell Fox News that evening. And all the while, Putin is just saying, no, no. There was a fellow called Andrei Gromyko, who was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and he was called Mr. No, because they refused to deal with anything. Putin's doing the same thing. He's saying no.
Yeah.
But the question I have today, John, is to try and explain in some sort of logical, historical, economic, geostrategical perspective why America is doing what it's doing, because it is such an extraordinary shock. And I'm going to borrow from a lovely piece I read recently by an old friend of the show, Noah Smith. Remember Noah and his rabbits?
Oh, Noah, yeah. Noah and the rabbits, yeah.
Yeah, well, Noah's Substack is one of the finest Substacks out there. And he is making an overarching, not so much a claim, but just an observation as to what might be happening. And it is the following. And I think it's well worth, before we talk about Ukraine, to try and give ourselves a sense, or at least a framework through which to observe what is going on in the world. You will remember our friend Talleyrand from the book Money, A Story of Humanity, which is going to be
marvelous
published in French,
tome that is.
which is going to be published in French very soon. And in actual fact, I have to go over there and talk about Talleyrand. But Talleyrand was referred to by Napoleon. I can imagine how much of a scoundrel you have to be, as shite in silk stockings, right? That's what he referred to him to, right? So think about the amount of enemies that Napoleon had on the way up, on the way down. He is outflanked on the left, on the right by Republicans, by demagogues, the conservative kings, all these things. So Napoleon would have come up against every sort of scoundrel. And yet he reserved the most dismissive, the most scandalous description for his foreign secretary.
And why was that? Why was that?
Because Talleyrand, at what we're going to talk about is the Congress of Vienna, betrayed Napoleon, right? Napoleon, and did a backhand deal with Metternich, who's going to be the hero of this particular podcast, who was an Austrian aristocrat and diplomat. Also, the fact that, amazingly, Talleyrand, who started his career as a bishop supporting the king, who was subsequently guillotined, and most of the bishops were guillotined too, ended up being not only the foreign minister of France, but the ambassador to the United Kingdom. Along the way, he created the country of Belgium. Along the way, he was the main player at the Congress of Vienna, which we're going to talk about. And along the way, he managed to slip the noose and the guillotine, work for Napoleon and the king and the revolutionaries, back to Napoleon, and ultimately for the Bourbon king. Now, how
slimy.
How much of a fucker do you have to be to get away with that? So we're going to talk to him. We're going to talk about him in the context of the Congress of Vienna. So here's the theory that was proposed by Noah Smith, and I think it's very interesting. He says, look, the way in which the MAGA movement have turned its back on the liberal, democratic establishment architecture that was built up over the last 50 years can only be seen from a geopolitical perspective, that they have shifted to do alliances with the Russians and the Chinese. Now, I'll explain all this against the context of the Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, do.
So after the Napoleonic Wars, so you have the French Revolution, you have the Napoleonic Wars, you have the massive expansion of Napoleonic ideology all over Europe. Now, Napoleonic ideology is Republican, it is anti-monarchist, and it is democratic.
Yeah.
Now, that was absolutely terrifying for the absolutist monarchies of Europe. So the monarchies in Britain, in Austria, in Russia, and of course in Prussia. So these are the big powers. So their big fear was, after Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, their idea was, what do we do with France? Do we divide France up, or do we keep France as it is? But if we keep France as it is, we have to figure out an alliance of strong, conservative, traditional, backward-looking, and I mean backward-looking in the sense that conservatives, it was our friend from Longford, Edmund Burke, John, from your homeland, right?
Yes,
He is the man who came up with the expression conservatism. And his idea was, you conserve things, you look backwards for legitimacy, you go slowly, you don't do revolutions, etc. On the other side of the coin was the French revolutionaries and the American revolutionaries. And they were, you destroy conservatism, you build up a republic, It's one man, one vote. It's democratic. And the enemy are your own internal aristocracy. So this is
Right.
essentially the battle for Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. And Metternich of Austria, who was the foreign minister of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, came up with this idea of a 5 great power conference where they would divide Europe up amongst themselves, so much so that the understanding was what kept them together, i.e., the big powers, what aligned them was greater than what set them apart. So what set them apart was empire, nationalism, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But what actually unified them together is they were all conservative.
And they all
wanted
just
to
sat
remain-
around the table and out with the pens and drew lines in the sand and came up
All
with
that
a
stuff.
plan to how they operate.
But basically, it's 1814, 1815, John. Vienna is the location. They were there for months on end because,
Oh, okay.
as Trump is now figure out, you don't end wars in a day, right?
Yes,
This takes
yeah,
long,
yeah, yeah.
complex negotiations, etc. But the key idea for the Congress of Vienna was that the European big powers would come together and not go to war against each other, but would divide up Europe into zones of interest and spheres of influence. And they would deal with so-called the little people in their sphere of interest. And those little people could have been Galicians or Croats or Serbs or whatever it was, right? In this case, it's going to be Ukrainians.
Yeah.
But that ultimately, the Congress of Vienna, which lasted amazingly, John, from 1815 to 1914, there was peace in Europe. So the supporters of the Congress of Vienna, including one Henry Kissinger, who wrote his thesis on it,
Yes.
believed that this great power alliance was the way in which you preserve peace in the world. And what was revolutionary, so socialism, republicanism, nationalism, all these isms, which emerged at the end of the peace of the Congress of Vienna, so at the First World War, they were essentially destabilizing factors. And that if you get the big piece right, all the little bits of the jigsaw fit in. But the problem with the little bits of the jigsaw is the little bits of the jigsaw are people, are
Yes.
countries.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So the theory is that in the same way as the conservatives of the 1814 and 1815s were totally shocked and traumatized by the potency of the Napoleonic Revolution, which we forget, Napoleon nearly took over Europe, right? And his ideas lodged in the head. This is the interesting thing. The French and American revolutions disappeared from the European cultural hinterland for nearly 100 years. But the ideas lived rent-free inside the minds of the establishment because they were always worried about socialism and republicanism and democracy and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And the entire European 19th century is an effort by the establishment to suppress these ideas, which were animating little people because little people thought, oh my God, we could be free in this world. So take that as a template. Conservative, reactionary, anti-democratic, anti-liberal, anti-little people. Now look at MAGA, right? The MAGA movement is a culture war. It's now become quite evident to me. I didn't realize quite how much it was against what they see as this revolutionary period through Obama into Biden.
Yeah.
The first Trump it was going on. This is back to your Steve Bannon idea.
Yeah.
That in actual fact, what was for the Duke of Wellington and Metternich and Talleyrand republicanism, French ideas at the time, is now wokeism. So they see, LGBT, that movement, they see the movement for diversity, equality, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Infecting what they would see, the police force, the army, the universities, the bureaucracies, the media, all that stuff. So what they see is a revolution, an internal enemy. And that internal enemy can be described in parentheses as wokeism. And basically wokeism is whatever you're having yourself, whatever you decide it is, right?
Yeah. Encapsulates everything.
But the people who are against wokeism in the world are Russia and Putin. So there's no LGBT movement. There's none of that democracy carry on. There's none of that liberalism, right? And of course, Xi, who has eradicated all forms of dissent in China. And so what Trumpism is trying to do is create an alliance with these anti-woke, anti-liberal, anti-essentially liberal democratic countries or movements with strongmen. The strongmen being Putin, Xi, and himself. And that's the world he sees in the same way as Metternich and Talleyrand and the Duke of Wellington and the Kaiser of Prussia and the Tsar of Russia all saw the world in 1814. And of course, that actually makes sense. It makes complete sense that they are now recalibrating the world in a way in which the Congress of Vienna recalibrated the world after the Napoleonic Wars. And they see wokeism and leftism in general and liberalism in general as dangerous to their worldview. And it's fascinating because J.D. Vance said this at Munich 4 weeks ago when he came in and they started to unveil this project. This was before Zelensky was humiliated.
Yes.
He said, I don't see the threat as China or Russia. I see the threat to Europe as your own internal enemies, which is immigration, Islamification, liberalism, wokeism, all these sort of things. So that allows us, John, to make some sense of what's happening in Ukraine.
But the thing that doesn't sit with me in all of this is that, you know, the whole, not wokeism, but the DEI element and the liberal element of all of this is that's where, and we've spoken about this before, that's where progress and innovation actually resides most.
We should hope so, John. We should hope so, because the free mind is the creative mind.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you look at Russia, have you ever seen a Russian, I mean, even before sanctions, right? Have you ever seen a Russian product in a Spar?
Don't think so.
In a supermarket?
Yeah, don't think so.
In a hardware shop?
Yeah.
Online?
Yeah.
No, they don't make anything. And that might...
Yeah, and China, you only have knockoffs of...
Yeah, but China...
China...
Stuff. But I think that basically what we're in now is a world in which China, America, and Russia are going to try to divide up the globe into spheres of influence. America will probably take its troops out of Europe, basically say our sphere of influence is America, North and South, Canada, and Greenland. That's what it makes all the sense. The whole thing makes sense. It's Canada, Greenland, we're all this one big area, Hawaii, etc. Then they draw a line down the middle of the Pacific, a line down the middle of the Atlantic. Europe is basically between the Europeans and the Russians to sort out. But it's basically, they think it's a Russian sphere of influence, certainly Central and Eastern Europe. And China owns Asia and runs Asia. And that's what they're doing. And that's why this...
Where's Australia come in?
The safest place in the world. That's where it is.
Yeah.
The safest place in the world. Exactly. But that's what makes complete sense, you know. That makes complete sense. And as to what happens to Africa, that's anyone's business. You know, they're not concerned about it. So that's why they're cutting back on aid and everything like that, because they don't care.
Yeah.
Right. So that, I think, is worth bearing in mind as we talk to our next guest, because it gives us a framework to explain and understand the shock that we feel as Europeans in our abandonment by the United States, because it makes sense now. Yeah. Because the idea that I don't believe, you know, that Putin has something on Trump or Trump's a Russian agent or all that. I'd like to believe conspiracy theories because it's good. It's good fun.
Yeah.
But I don't believe it.
I love them.
I know you love them. I'm a little bit different. But let's take that as a... So basically, it is the Congress of Vienna, the Council of Europe, the 19th century settlement between Russia, Austria-Hungary, France, Britain, and Prussia, the five big powers, and how they carved up Europe between themselves and didn't care about the little countries. Didn't care. We know that as Irish people, they didn't care about us. We were just trampled over. We were just part of the UK, and that was it. And we just got on with it, right? And of course, we know the 19th century was appalling for little countries, particularly countries like Ireland, We had a terrible time. We had the worst 19th century of all.
Mm.
Basically, you've got the penal laws, then no Catholic emancipation, then the bloody famine, then the deindustrialization of the country, then a mass immigration. So we experienced all, but I'm just saying that's our framework. So let's keep that in the back of our heads as we go to talk about a country that is significant. It is being carved up at the moment.
Yep.
That is Ukraine. It's been carved up at the moment. And the problem is Ukraine's just the first. It's not going to be the last. Ukraine's just the first country. So let's go to Olesya Khromeychuk in London, a wonderful historian, Ukrainian historian, and let's get the view of the Ukrainians. Now, this week, although it has been unconfirmed, Putin and Trump will talk about the future of Ukraine without the Ukrainians actually being present. And this podcast today, I want to coincide with that meeting. I want to discuss with a real serious heavyweight historian, a woman who's writing, and I'm telling you, if you have not read Olesya Khromeychuk's work, just go to her website and there's books, there's interviews, there's blogs, all sorts of things. She is a historian based in London, but from Ukraine. Olesya, it is wonderful to see you. How are you doing?
David, John, thank you so much for inviting me. It's wonderful talking to you.
Great stuff. Now let's get right into Ukraine. A very fascinating thing, Olesya, and I think I've heard you speak about this before, is that Ukraine, biggest country in Europe, 40 odd million people, and yet I'm not sure that people really understand the recent history of Ukraine that brings us to the war. Can you give us a little potted history of the big events in Ukraine, and let's say since prior to the Second World War, to just give us a sense of this huge, vast country?
Yes. I mean, the fact that you emphasize that it's a huge country is already telling, because up until 3 years ago, I think people considered Ukraine to be a small country overshadowed by Russia. And to be fair, anything next to Russia will look small, but it is the largest country within Europe. And that has not been understood until recently. Why hasn't it been understood? Why is Ukrainian history so poorly known? It's because we tend to focus on the histories of imperial centers. And then anything outside of that center tends to be viewed from the point of view of the center of the empire. And I think I don't need to explain that to the Irish audience. I think it's fully understood. And that's what Ukrainians have suffered from for a very long time. And not just Ukrainians, Central Europe, broadly speaking, was understood through the eyes of Moscow. In other words, misunderstood as something insignificant, as something that doesn't have a clear sense of self, as a nation that doesn't really exist, that has been manufactured by all sorts of other nations, and that is nothing to be invested in. When in fact, what we're missing is that Ukrainians regained their independence 3 decades ago in 1991. And I'm saying regained independence because there have been attempts at forming a polity, an independent state before that, 100 years before that. So in the interwar period, it was brief, but it allowed Ukrainians from different parts of former empires to come together into the same polity, because before that, Ukraine, as we know it now, was split between the Russian Empire, mostly, or Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you had people who were subjects to different rulers and were forced in some cases, like in Russia, or encouraged in cases like in Austria-Hungary, to speak other languages other than the Ukrainian language. So whether that's Polish, German, or Russian in the case of the Russian Empire. But they had a very clear sense of being different, of being Ukrainian, the sense that developed in the 19th century. How did it develop? And here, I think, is another interesting thing that few people know about Ukraine. We don't really revere rulers. We're very suspicious of
It's a very
authority.
healthy attitude to have.
Indeed, and for very good reason too. Mostly because our rulers were imposed on us from outside. And the ones that were not imposed, we lose faith in them quite quickly, which I think is relatively healthy as well. But who we do revere is people of culture, artists, poets, writers. And that sense of self was very much forged by the Ukrainian authors, writers, in particular Taras Shevchenko in the 19th century, a great Ukrainian poet who is known as the founder of Ukrainian nation. whose lines from poetry continue to influence Ukrainians today on the front lines and outside. I love quoting this very simple two-liner, "Борітеся, поборете," keep fighting and you will prevail. This is, these are the lines from the 19th century, but they are repeated on the front lines today. And so that sense of self was very much there, and it allowed us to come together at times of crisis and to know that we have a shared goal. That we might be different, we might have very different past, we might have very different political views, ideas of what an independent Ukraine should look like, what sort of project it should be, but we know we want it to be independent. So when it came to 1991, and I'm jumping here ahead from the interwar period to 1991, again, something that people don't realize is when there was a referendum on the 1st of December 1991 to confirm the declaration of independence by the Ukrainian parliament, over 90% of people in every single part of Ukraine said yes, including Crimea.
Wow.
Even in Crimea, the majority voted yes. In Donetsk region, in Luhansk region, all over Ukraine, vast majority said yes. So there was absolutely no doubt that Ukrainians wanted to be a sovereign, independent state and that they were prepared to make it work in spite of their differences. Look, every country has regional differences. It's normal. And it's particularly understandable for a country that's been separated into different states before it was able to regain independence. So I think there's a lot of lessons that we can draw from the history of Ukraine if we choose to read it, if we choose to study it. Lessons that are convenient or useful for us now as we think of how to rescue our own democracies.
Well, now let's look at the history of Ukraine and the relationship with Russia before we talk about the last couple of weeks' change in Washington. The relationship with Russia, has it always been the overbearing imperial power to the east, constantly acquiring territory, acquiring culture, acquiring language? Has the relationship always been fraught? Because a lot of Ukrainians seem to be married to Russians, a lot of them know each other, a lot of them studied there, all that sort of stuff. So you're kind of mixed and yet separate.
Yes, the short answer is yes. It's always been one where Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian identity has been undermined. And any kind of peace was only possible if Ukrainians accepted that position of a younger brother or a younger relative, less significant. And as soon as they raised their heads and wanted to be heard on equal terms, those kind of attempts were immediately suppressed. So going back to that interwar period when Ukraine gained independence for a brief period of time, what the Bolsheviks, who were coming to power in what then became the USSR, understood is precisely that the Ukrainians are not just a variant of the Russian people, that they will fight for their own sovereignty. And that is why the Soviet Ukrainian Republic was created. There was a sort of pretense at self-rule. Now, sadly, it did become a pretense. It wasn't a real opportunity for Ukrainians to be autonomous. And of course, Stalin put an end to any expression of autonomy whatsoever. And that is why you see a vast generation of Ukrainian people of culture of that period, of the 1920s. And we're talking about fantastic type of art, avant-garde, really experimental, wonderful literature and art and theater, completely destroyed in the 30s. These people were socialists. These people were, in many cases, enchanted by the ideas of communism and what Bolsheviks were propagating too. But they were destroyed because they wanted autonomy for Ukraine. They wanted to build socialism or whatever ideas they had in Ukraine as an autonomous entity. And that was not allowed. So that's just an example of how as soon as you raise your head and try to stand as equal, Kremlin will try and suppress you. And they've been doing that, sadly, successfully, to the point of people outside of Ukraine not realizing that there was and is this flourishing Ukrainian culture. And there is these questions often, well, how come we don't have, or we don't know of Ukrainian Pushkin or Ukrainian Dostoevsky? Well, partly because they haven't been translated into languages that are widely available, and partly because Russians managed to kill a lot of people, or the Soviets, the Kremlin, a lot of those people before they were able to continue to produce great work. I'd like to share with your listeners a story of a woman called Victoria Amelina, who was a friend and a fantastic writer, poet, who was killed in Kramatorsk in 2023 in a missile strike attack on a restaurant in essentially a war crime. She was a writer and she became a poet as well, and she trained herself as a war crimes investigator because she felt that as a writer, it wasn't enough to write about this horrendous war. She needed to bear witness to people's testimonies of occupation, of liberation, and so on. This is post 2022 full scale invasion. And she wrote really well about these parallels of the generations previously destroyed by the Kremlin in Ukraine, generation of creatives, and said, we are witnessing another generation of Ukrainian creatives being destroyed. The people who are able to talk, to communicate Ukrainian culture to the rest of the world and put it on people's mental map. And sadly, she was killed in this war as well. And there's a book that's just come out last month in English, because she was writing it already in English, called Women Looking at War by Victoria Amelina. And that book in itself is a document of what we were witnessing in Ukraine. She didn't complete the book. It was completed on her behalf by a group of editors. And so you begin by reading fantastic writing, truly the sort of writing that I think would win and should win all major European prizes. And then the book disintegrates because as you go through the book, you see that it becomes unfinished. It's just notes that people found in her phone. And that's what we're seeing happening to Ukrainian culture as such, because Russia's doing its worst to destroy it.
Now, you spoke about testimony there. You have your own testimony. Your brother was killed in this war. At the beginning of this war, or let's say the part one of this war. Explain that to me. Explain why he signed up, where he was fighting, and how you've dealt with that.
Thank you for letting me talk about my brother Volodya. Always like bringing him back into conversation. I feel like when I do, he continues to fight. What people forget is that the war did not begin in 2022. It started in 2014 with the illegal occupation of Crimea and the beginning of hostilities in eastern Ukraine, at the time when the rest of the world chose to believe Putin's lies that Russia's not involved. A big mistake, which we haven't learned from, that if we create this place for impunity, if we do not respond to crimes being committed, they will only escalate. And that is exactly what happened in 2022. That was an escalation of the war into full-scale war. So my brother was a very ordinary guy, and in some ways he is very similar to many fighters of the Ukrainian armed forces today. A civilian, not a professional military. He was an artist. He lived in Western Europe for a very long time, in the Netherlands, came back to Ukraine. And then in 2015, so a year into the start of the war, he decided to sign up as a volunteer, fought for a year and a half, demobilized, and went straight back to the front. And when he went straight back to the front, I asked him why he was doing that, why he didn't want to just continue his civilian life. He said, you say you're a historian, you say you understand this part of the world, but what you fail to understand is this is a European war that happened to start in eastern Ukraine. Maybe I did understand it at the time, but I chose not to accept it. Much like a lot of Western Europeans are choosing not to accept now that this is a European war. It just happens to take place in Ukraine. And I think the sooner we understand that, the better. But yes, my brother was killed at the front in 2017. And this is when President Trump was already in power, by the way. So when he talks about, well, if it wasn't, if
it wasn't for me,
this war wouldn't have happened. But he was already in power at the time that the war was ongoing, and he chose to believe Putin's lies at the time.
And he's now not only choosing to believe Putin's lies, but for most of us West Europeans, he's parroting the Kremlin's line. Now, let us link those two together. The notion of a European war that just happens to be happening in eastern Ukraine, number one, and Moscow's ability to persuade the MAGA Trump guys that they are the good guys in this, that they are the ones. I mean, I think Trump said last week, why did you start a fight with a bigger brother or something like this? And it's like, well, hold on a second. So can you explain to me the sense of how Ukrainians are feeling now, having digested America's reversal in the last 2 or 3 weeks?
Yes, there's a great sense of anxiety that our fate has been once again decided over our heads. You asked me about historical parallels. Ukraine has been viewed as a buffer zone for far too long. And I think, again, these are the sort of lessons that are not being learned, because if you create a buffer zone, that territory can very quickly turn into a war zone. And that's what we've seen in Ukraine. So it's a very short sighted approach to take by the democratic leaders to turn a place into a buffer zone. But that's how we feel at the moment. There's a sense of frustration that after 11 years of war and 3 years of full-scale war and resistance, fierce resistance by the Ukrainian people, largely left to their own devices, with a lot of help, military and financial help, from the international community, but still fighting on their own on the battlefield. What we're witnessing is the war criminal being rewarded for the crimes that he's committed. And there's, I think, also anxiety around uncertainty whether Western European leaders have had the sort of wake up call that they won't just put on snooze. Because we saw this mobilization of Western European leaders and finally beginning to realize that this is about their security as well as that of Ukraine. But the reasons for that are flawed, because the reasons are not witnessing a country being destroyed on their doorstep for 3 years, not to mention the 8 years before that. The reason is because the US administration has changed the tune. And I
Yes.
worry that that's the reason for their mobilization, means that they might hit the snooze button again and turn over to the other side.
What does that look like then? I mean, because this is basically what is going to be discussed and anointed over the course of the next few weeks. So what does it look like for you? A kind of a second-rate Europeans, we're just acting because the Yanks have changed their position, but in actual fact, what would really suit Europe is for Ukraine to quietly have a settlement, and we forget about it.
I'm going to be uncharacteristically optimistic and say that I think, and I'm emphasizing West European leaders here rather than European more generally, because I think there's a part of Europe that has understood this from day one, because they know they have their own relationship with the Kremlin, and they know from, historic, they know not to believe the lies. But West European leaders, I think, have been somehow assuming that they can sit this out, that it's not going to affect their countries for a long time. But I'd like to think that now they understand that if Ukraine loses its sovereignty, that will create a much larger and much more expensive. You talk about economics, there you go. If it comes to expense, and sadly, it's often these kind of things are not measured in other people's lives, but they tend to be measured in your own treasury and what you can afford. If Ukraine loses sovereignty, it'll be a much bigger problem, much more expensive problem for them to deal with, because a poor ceasefire, which seems to be what President Trump is trying to negotiate with Putin, is likely to be an invitation to a larger war. We talk about not learning from our mistakes. It's likely to lead to a relatively short pause in which Russia can regroup, get more North Korean troops, get more Iranian drones, manufacture their own weapons, and essentially follow through on what they've already been promising: subjugation of the rest of Ukraine and attack on a NATO member state in the EU. So I think there's a realization that it's better not to allow that to happen, and that the European leaders will act on it. And also, I think there's a realization that 2022 was also a mistake, leaving Ukraine with no weapons. And so there's a way of seeking funding from, for instance, Russian frozen assets, to make sure that we improve our defenses in throughout Europe, but also that Ukraine has sufficient means to arm itself for the next wave of Russian aggression.
So for you as a Ukrainian, this is part of a pattern that has been going on for many, arguably centuries, that this is not new, and that if the West allows this sort of deal, which gives Putin some parts of eastern Ukraine, which allows him to declare a victory, and he'll have a parade in the Kremlin, you think he'll be back in a number of years?
Oh, absolutely. I think years is probably optimistic. Yes. And when people ask me, when will this war end? I mean, I hate predicting the future, especially of that kind. I'm a historian. But what I think we need to realize is the threat of this war will not go away for as long as Russia's able to use its nuclear blackmail. And it's been using it extremely successfully. It has held much of the West absolutely terrified of its
Completely.
blackmail. And the other thing is that it's not just, this is what Serhiy Plokhy, another historian, great Ukrainian historian, talks about, that, while we focus on Russia's nuclear weapons, we forget that this war became nuclear from day one, when Chernobyl was occupied by the Russian troops and now deoccupied. But also the fact that Russia is occupying nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. And this is one of the so-called assets, as President Trump put it, that is being discussed as part of the peace deal. It's fascinating how we talk about territory and assets as if we're making some kind of business deal between real estate people, and perhaps that is exactly how
Well,
we treat it.
I think that's the way he sees the world. He sees the world
Indeed.
as a balance sheet, and there's debts, and there's credits, and there's assets, and
But we're not talking about people who live on those territories, who are in occupation, who are living in the constant threat of being taken to a torture chamber, children that are being forced to completely reject their identity and are punished for speaking Ukrainian, who are now being drafted. Young men who grew up through this war are now being drafted into the Russian army to fight against their own compatriots. Kids who have been kidnapped and taken to Russia and adopted, and it's going to be extremely difficult to get them back. We're not talking about any of this. We're talking about real estate. And I think this is also a role of Europeans to remind ourselves about the principles on which we created our alliances, that we can't let the world to be split into spheres of influence again, like it was in 1945. That, we've created these institutions for a reason, and we pride ourselves on basing them on human rights. If this kind of deal is allowed to happen, justice will go totally out of the window, and it'll be on our responsibility as well, on our conscience, as well as that of the people who want to put this deal on the table.
well, let's see. What we might do is let's maybe come back to this conversation in a couple of weeks' time to see if there's any clarity, there's any visibility, what is actually happening. But this has been really eye-opening history of a country that, to use that Chamberlainian view, of which most people don't know very much about. And yet, as you said, there is a European war that just happens to be fought there right now, but it could move very rapidly towards the West.
Indeed.
So wonderful stuff.
David, thank you so much for talking to me.
So Olesya, she ended there saying exactly what you were saying at the beginning, about these spheres of influence, and we can't let this happen. But I'm not sure how we can stop it, because, this is Trump's whole thing. Like, he's kind of saying, I'm going to do what I do because who's going to stop me? And we see that with, when Ukraine are being excluded from the actual talks about them and about their future. It's just so insulting and so bizarre.
Well, it's insulting, it's bizarre, but it's also very chilling, because it means that the ideas of small nations having equal billing to large nations, which was one of the foundational blocks, particularly of the European Union. You see Ireland having the same say as Germany in the European Union. I mean, that was an extraordinary diplomatic win for small countries. If that's going to go out the door on a global scale, then I think what we're looking at, we're back to the 19th century.
Yeah.
And, we spoke about at the top of the show. It's the 19th century. It's might is right. Its power is ultimate. And little people wait for the crumbs on the table. And again, in the Trump Xi Putin world, Europe is a small country. Despite the fact there's 420 million of us and we have a much higher GDP, we just don't have that kind of muscular military power and hard power that we used to have. And as a result of that,
anyway.
For now, but think about it. Europe is not even at the negotiating table.
Yeah.
For what is a European war that is happening in Eastern Europe, but could quite easily, conceivably spread. And it brings to mind the old adage, John, we'll leave it here. If you're not at the table, there's a very good chance you're on the menu. And Europe is on the menu.